The world had once been filled with the usual noise of city life. Cars honking, people shouting over the noise of 1,000 conversations, the hum of electronics everywhere. Every street was a maze of movement. But now, all that was left was silence. Silence so thick it felt suffocating, as if the air itself had been drained of any life, leaving only the eerie rustle of the wind sweeping through abandoned streets. Ethan, a once average man with no special skills or qualifications, was learning how to survive in this strange, new world. He had always been a creature of routine: wake up, work, eat, sleep. But that was before the outbreak. Before everything changed. It began, like all disasters do, slowly. People noticed something was off. It started with a few unverified reports of strange incidents, people going missing, bizarre behavior in public places, sudden violence. But it wasn't until the first video emerged online, showing a person attacking another in a way that defied any explanation, that the world began to wake up. By then, it was already too late. At first, Ethan didn't think it would touch him. He had been one of those people who dismissed the warnings, thinking it was just another media panic. The government had assured the public that the situation was under control. But the screams that filled the night a week later told him otherwise. The first true encounter with the undead came in the early hours, when the moon hung high above an abandoned cityscape, casting shadows that seemed to dance in the darkness. It was then that he realized that the world he knew was no longer the one he would be waking up to each day. Ethan had been in his apartment when the chaos started. A piercing scream echoed from the street below, and instinctively, he went to his window to look. The sight that met him was beyond anything he had imagined: people running in all directions, some in pursuit of others, others clearly being chased. The air was thick with panic. His neighbors were either too scared or too frozen to act, and before long, the street was overrun with chaos. There was no escape. He ran to his front door, heart racing, and slammed it shut behind him. For hours, he waited in the shadows, trying to make sense of what was happening. The sounds from the streets were disturbing: growls, moans, screams that faded into the sickening silence. Ethan had never been an active person, he'd never learned survival tactics, had never been good with a weapon. But one thing he knew was clear: he needed to leave. Grabbing his bag, he hurried to the back of the building, where he found an emergency escape ladder. The door to the alley was barricaded, but with a few grunts and desperate pushes, Ethan managed to pry it open. The cold, night air hit him with a sting, but it was better than staying inside. He needed to find safety. In a world that no longer made sense, survival was his only instinct. Ethan's first steps into the streets of the city were met with a haunting quiet, broken only by the occasional distant groan. His mind raced with thoughts of his family. He hadn't heard from his parents or his sister in days. The radio was out, cell phone signals had long since died, and all he had was his instinct to guide him. He needed to get out of the city, but where could he go? The roads were blocked, and from the occasional flashes of light he saw in the distance, he knew that the roads were filled with people, dead or alive, that wouldn't hesitate to attack anyone who got too close. As he walked through the desolate streets, avoiding the occasional zombie that wandered too close, Ethan realized the true horror of this new world. The calm before the storm was now an eternal quiet, broken only by the nightmares of the undead. His mind swirled with questions. Why had this happened? Was there a cure? Could anyone still be alive? His thoughts were interrupted when he stumbled upon a sign for a local shelter. He wasn't sure if it was still operational, but it was worth investigating. The possibility of safety, even for a few hours, was all he could cling to. As he approached the shelter, the heavy silence made him nervous. There was no sign of movement, no sounds from within. Everything about the place felt wrong. Inside, the lights were flickering, and the place was in disarray, as if people had fled in a hurry. Ethan moved cautiously through the building, hoping to find some clues about what had happened. The last thing he wanted was to encounter a survivor who might be more dangerous than the zombies themselves. Then, from a darkened corner of the shelter, came a sound. A quiet, deliberate footstep. Ethan froze. Could it be another survivor? Or something much worse? the answer would come sooner than he expected. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears as he slowly turned toward the source of the noise. The dim light cast long shadows across the shelter, and the silence felt even heavier now, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The only sound he could hear was his own shallow breathing, amplified in the stillness. The figure that emerged from the shadows wasn't what he expected. It wasn't one of the undead, nor was it another panicked survivor. Instead, it was a woman, young, maybe in her late 20s, with a dirty and torn jacket. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mix of fear and determination. She held a broken piece of metal in her hand like a weapon, ready to strike if needed. Ethan froze, unsure of what to do. He hadn't been around many people since the outbreak, and the thought of encountering another living human stirred both relief and suspicion within him. He'd heard the rumors of people turning on each other, of survivors becoming as dangerous as the monsters outside. Trust was a luxury that no longer existed in this world. The woman's eyes darted around the room as if she were trying to decide whether to fight or flee. Ethan didn't move. Slowly, he raised his hands in a non-threatening gesture. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice hoarse and trembling slightly. "I'm just trying to survive." The woman didn't lower the metal rod. Instead, she eyed him for a moment longer before speaking, her voice shaking but steady. "You don't look like one of them," she said, glancing nervously around the shelter, as if expecting the walls themselves to come alive with the dead. "But that doesn't mean I trust you." Ethan nodded, understanding the caution. In this new world, trust was a commodity that had to be earned, not given freely. He lowered his hands slowly and took a step closer. "I'm looking for a way out of the city," Ethan said. "I don't know where to go, but I can't stay here. It's not safe." The woman's eyes softened just slightly, but she didn't lower her guard. Instead, she glanced toward a side door, partially hidden behind a stack of overturned furniture. "There's an old route that might lead us out," she said, her voice quieter now. "I've been here for a few days. Haven't seen anyone alive, except for you." Ethan glanced over his shoulder at the dark, empty space of the shelter. The silence was suffocating. The thought of being alone again made his skin crawl, but the thought of trusting someone he had just met felt equally dangerous. Still, he had no other choice. Alone, he was a target, easy prey for both the zombies and anyone else looking to survive at any cost. "I don't know your name," Ethan said, cautiously. "Mine's Ethan." "Sarah," the woman replied. Her eyes softened again, but she still kept her distance, wary of his every move. "And if we're going to get out of here alive, we need to stick together." The unspoken understanding passed between them. No one could afford to be alone in a world that had become a nightmare, and every new ally, no matter how temporary, was a lifeline. Without another word, Sarah motioned for Ethan to follow her, leading him toward the side door. The door creaked open with a low, unsettling noise, the hinges protesting the movement after being untouched for so long. Ethan's heart raced, but he didn't hesitate. There was no time to waste. The city outside was filled with the dangers of both the undead and the unknown. The moment they stepped outside, the full weight of the apocalypse hit him. The streets were empty, save for the occasional debris scattered along the road. The city, once alive and bustling, was now a graveyard of buildings and forgotten lives. It was quieter than it had ever been, the silence pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. He could see the faint outlines of structures in the distance, but they didn't offer any comfort. They only reminded him that he was lost in a world that no longer made sense. Sarah led the way down a narrow alley, her eyes constantly scanning the area for danger. Ethan did the same, his senses on high alert. Every sound, every movement, made his heart race, unsure if it was a zombie or something far more dangerous. The days of complacency were gone. There was no room for error in this new world. As they turned a corner, a distant groan echoed through the empty streets. It was faint, but unmistakable. A zombie. Ethan's stomach twisted at the sound, his muscles tensing in anticipation. The last thing he wanted was to face one of those things in the open. But before he could react, Sarah tugged at his arm, pulling him into a darkened doorway of a nearby building. The two of them crouched in the shadows, holding their breath, hoping the creature wouldn't notice them. The groans grew louder, closer. And then, just as quickly, the sound faded into the distance, leaving them in an uneasy silence. Sarah's hand remained firmly on Ethan's arm as they waited. Her grip was tight, but not from fear. She was calculating, focused. After a long moment, she whispered, "We need to move quickly. They can smell fear." Ethan nodded, swallowing his anxiety. The world had already become a place where survival depended on the smallest decisions, the slightest movements. Every second counted. "Let's go," he whispered back, already steeling himself for whatever the next few moments might bring. 1/2. Ethan and Sarah moved swiftly through the dark alley, trying to remain as silent as possible. The air around them was thick with tension, and every creak of the building's old wooden frame made their hearts race. The faintest sound could bring them face to face with the undead, and they both knew that even the smallest mistake could be their last. As they made their way deeper into the city, the ruins of civilization stretched out before them. The roads, once filled with bustling cars and people, were now empty, littered with debris and the occasional abandoned vehicle. The buildings around them were worn down, with broken windows and shattered doors. Some of the structures still bore the scars of violence, burned-out husks of once thriving shops and homes. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as he looked around. There was something haunting about the world they had left behind. It was a world where laughter, conversation, and dreams no longer existed. All that remained was survival. "Where are we headed?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. His voice felt strange in the stillness, as if the very air had absorbed all the sound from the world. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. "There's a safe house," she said, her voice low but steady. "It's not far from here, but we'll need to be careful. The horde has been moving closer to this part of the city." Ethan's mind raced. The horde. He'd heard rumors about the massive groups of zombies that roamed the streets, devouring anything they could find. He had yet to encounter one of those massive mobs, but he could feel the presence of danger growing with every passing moment. They turned another corner, and Ethan caught sight of the remains of what used to be a convenience store. The shelves were stripped bare, and the windows were smashed. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, as if it had been violently forced open. A few discarded personal items littered the ground: clothes, a shattered phone, an overturned shopping cart. "This place used to be normal," Ethan muttered, his voice almost wistful. "It's hard to believe that people were just going about their lives a few weeks ago." Sarah's face was grim as she nodded. "Yeah, things change fast when you're fighting to survive. Everything feels like a lifetime ago." They kept moving, staying in the shadows as much as possible. They avoided open spaces, knowing that if they made too much noise or drew too much attention, they would be swarmed. Their eyes were constantly scanning the area for signs of movement, anything that could hint at the presence of the undead. After what felt like hours of tense silence, they finally reached the edge of the city. The familiar skyline of tall buildings began to fade, replaced by an open, barren expanse. The road ahead was quiet, eerily quiet. It was like a desert, but the danger was far more real. The landscape was littered with the ruins of vehicles and the occasional destroyed structure. In the distance, Ethan could see the shadowy outline of the safe house Sarah had mentioned. It wasn't much, just a rundown cabin in the woods, but it was the closest thing they had to safety. Just as they started to head toward it, Ethan heard a low groan. He froze. Sarah's hand shot out, gripping his arm with a vice-like hold, pulling him into the shadows of a nearby building. "Stay quiet," she whispered urgently. "They're close." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he strained to hear. The groan grew louder, followed by another, and then another. A small group of zombies had appeared at the far end of the street, stumbling aimlessly as they sniffed the air, searching for anything alive to feast on. His heart hammered in his chest as the undead slowly moved in their direction. Ethan could feel Sarah's grip tighten around his arm, but she didn't make a sound. They both knew the rule: no noise. No movement unless absolutely necessary. The zombies were closer now, just a few yards away. Ethan held his breath, praying that they wouldn't notice the two of them crouched in the darkness. One of the zombies, a man with a bloody shirt and vacant eyes, wandered closer, its feet dragging slowly over the broken pavement. The stench of decay wafted toward them, and Ethan had to fight the urge to gag. The smell was unbearable, the rot so thick it felt as though it might choke him. Ethan's muscles were locked in place, his entire body tense with fear. The undead were only a few steps away now, their heads lolling to the side as they sniffed the air. Ethan could feel his pulse in his neck, the panic rising inside him. If they made a sound now, they'd be dead. He had no doubt about that. Just as one of the zombies turned, seemingly sniffing directly at their hiding spot, Sarah slowly inched her hand down to the metal pipe at her waist. She was ready to fight, ready to defend their lives with whatever she had, but there was no guarantee they would make it out of this. The zombie took another step forward, its foot scraping along the ground, just inches from where Ethan was hiding. Then, unexpectedly, a loud crash echoed in the distance, the sound of something heavy toppling over. The zombies jerked their heads toward the noise, and in that split second, Sarah pulled Ethan back, tugging him further into the shadows. The undead, distracted by the sound, stumbled in the opposite direction, leaving the two survivors hidden in the dark. Ethan exhaled sharply, his chest heaving. They had made it, this time. That was too close, he whispered, his voice shaking. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She just looked toward the safe house, her expression hardening. There was no time to waste. "We keep moving," she said, her voice firm. "We can't afford to be caught again." Ethan nodded. The silence had returned, but it felt different now. It was a warning. The world had changed forever, and each step they took was a fight for survival. The tension between Ethan and Sarah was palpable as they continued their trek toward the safe house. Every step felt heavier than the last, each one echoing louder in the empty world around them. The distant groans of zombies had faded, but the constant threat of danger lingered in the air, pressing on their shoulders like an invisible weight. It was almost as if the world itself had become a vast, silent predator, waiting for them to make a mistake. Ethan kept glancing over at Sarah, watching how she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had long learned the brutal rules of this new world. Her face was determined, but he could see the weariness in her eyes. She hadn't spoken much since the close call with the zombies, and he could feel the strain in every movement she made. The apocalypse wasn't just a physical battle, it was psychological, too. Every moment of quiet, every corner turned, carried the weight of uncertainty. Trust was a fragile thing, and even though they had worked together to escape, neither one of them could truly relax. They finally reached the cabin that Sarah had mentioned. It looked like something out of a nightmare, the wood darkened with age and rot. The windows were covered with boards, and a sagging porch hung precariously off the front. It looked abandoned, but that was part of the reason Sarah had chosen it. In a world full of hostile survivors and roaming zombies, it was better to hide in plain sight. "Looks like no one's been here for a while," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. The fear of being overheard by something, or someone, kept him on edge. Sarah nodded, but there was something about her eyes that made Ethan hesitate. There was a weariness in her gaze, a silent calculation that told him this place wasn't as safe as it seemed. It was a feeling he couldn't shake, like walking into a trap. But he kept his thoughts to himself. The world was full of traps now, and there was no other option. She stepped up to the door and, with a practiced movement, pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The cabin's interior was dim, the air thick with the smell of dust and mildew. It was empty, save for a few pieces of old furniture, chairs that had long since seen better days and a rickety table in the corner. A fireplace stood on one side, its hearth cold and filled with ash. Ethan stepped inside, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. It was far from comfortable, but it was shelter. He could hear Sarah moving behind him, checking the corners of the room, ensuring it was safe. "We can rest here for a while," Sarah said, her voice more subdued now. She set down her bag and pulled out a few basic supplies, canned food, a half-empty water bottle, and a first aid kit that had seen better days. "I'll keep watch. You get some sleep." Ethan hesitated. There was something about Sarah's insistence on staying alert that unsettled him. Even here, in what seemed like a safe place, she wasn't willing to let her guard down. "I'll take the first shift," Ethan offered, trying to break the silence that had fallen between them. "You've been leading this whole time." She met his gaze for a brief moment, her eyes searching his face. "Fine. But wake me up in a few hours." Ethan nodded, though the unease still gnawed at him. He took a seat on one of the old chairs, his eyes scanning the dim room. The silence in the cabin felt different from the outside world. It wasn't the kind of peaceful silence that came with solitude. This was a silence that was pregnant with dread, with the unspoken understanding that the world outside was a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. Hours passed, though Ethan wasn't sure how many. The tension of waiting for something to happen wore on him, making him hyper-aware of every sound. A bird calling outside, the distant rustle of wind moving through the trees, it all seemed amplified, as if the world itself was on the verge of collapse. And then, just as he was starting to drift into an uneasy sleep, he heard it. A faint thud. Almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable in its intent. It came from outside. The noise was followed by another, louder this time. Ethan's heart stopped. He got to his feet, making his way over to the window. Through the small cracks in the boards, he could just make out the movement of figures in the distance. Zombies. There were at least 3 of them stumbling toward the cabin, their limbs jerking awkwardly with every step. They didn't seem to notice him yet, but he knew that could change in an instant. They were closing in. Ethan's mind raced. There was no time to wake Sarah now, they needed to move. But where could they go? The woods around them offered some cover, but it wasn't enough. It was too open, and the undead could smell them if they tried to make a run for it. His pulse quickened as he scanned the room. There were only a few places to hide, and none of them seemed safe. The small closet in the corner, the attic, or maybe even beneath the floorboards, but they would have to act fast. If the zombies heard them, they'd be surrounded. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by Sarah's voice, low and urgent. "Ethan, what's happening?" He turned to her, his mouth dry. "Zombies. At least 3 of them. We need to hide, now." Without waiting for a response, he grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the closet. They crouched down inside, the darkness closing around them. Ethan could feel Sarah's breath on his neck, sharp and shallow. They could hear the footsteps of the zombies approaching, each one closer than the last. The air was thick with fear, and for a moment, Ethan wasn't sure if they would make it out alive. But then, as if the world was mocking their efforts, he heard another noise. This time, it wasn't just the zombies. It was the unmistakable sound of another survivor. And they were getting closer. "Stay quiet," Sarah whispered urgently. "If it's another person, we need to be ready." The silence in the closet was deafening. Ethan's heart raced in his chest as he tried to steady his breathing, his hand gripping the edge of the door. The faint sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, and then, nothing. The world outside seemed to freeze in place. He could hear the occasional rustle, but nothing that would give away the identity of the person, or thing, moving outside. Ethan's thoughts were scattered. He kept glancing at Sarah, her face a mask of tense determination. He could see the muscle in her jaw twitch, a clear sign of the strain she was under. It was hard to tell whether she was preparing for a fight or bracing for the inevitable. The air in the small closet was thick, musty. Every breath felt heavy as the scent of old wood and stale air filled his lungs. Ethan could barely see anything in the darkness, just the faint outline of Sarah beside him and the vague silhouette of their surroundings. He could feel the weight of every second passing, the uncertainty making him feel as though the walls were closing in on him. Then, suddenly, the footsteps resumed. Ethan's body tensed. He could hear the steady rhythm of someone walking, their boots scraping against the ground. They weren't trying to be quiet. Whoever they were, they didn't care if they were heard. The sound of their steps was slow, deliberate. He exchanged a glance with Sarah, and she nodded silently. It was clear they were both ready for whatever came next. But nothing prepared them for what happened next. The figure stepped into the view from behind a crack in the closet door. Ethan barely caught the movement, but his heart skipped a beat when he saw the figure. A man, perhaps in his early 30s, with wild, unkempt hair and a long beard. His clothes were torn, the fabric stained with grime and dirt. He was armed with a hunting knife, its blade glinting in the dim light as he carefully navigated the room. Ethan held his breath, praying the stranger wouldn't notice them. The man stopped in front of the window and peered through the cracks in the boards, his face tense as he scanned the area. The zombies were still nearby, but he seemed entirely unfazed by their presence. In fact, he didn't seem to care much about anything other than his surroundings. The stranger muttered something under his breath, a quiet stream of curses and fragmented thoughts. Ethan could barely make out the words, but there was one thing that stood out clearly. "I know you're in here," the man whispered, his voice rough and strained. "Don't even think about hiding." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The man knew they were there. Somehow, he had sensed their presence. How? Ethan didn't know, but his instincts told him that this man wasn't just a survivor, he was someone dangerous. Someone who might have been living on the edge for far too long, someone who'd been pushed to the brink by the horrors of this new world. "Don't move," Sarah whispered, her eyes narrowed, her hands still gripping the makeshift weapon at her side. Ethan barely had time to react before the man took a step forward, his eyes scanning the room with alarming precision. He stopped just inches from the closet, his boots almost brushing against the door. Ethan could feel the man's presence through the thin wood. "Enough of this," the stranger growled. His voice had dropped, low and dangerous. "I've been tracking you for hours, and I'm not leaving until I get what I came for." Ethan's blood ran cold. What did he mean by that? Had they been followed all this time? Was this some kind of trap? In that moment, Sarah's grip tightened on her weapon. She took a deep breath and, without warning, she flung the closet door open. The man was too close to react, and before he could make a move, Sarah lunged at him, knocking him off balance. "Get back," she yelled to Ethan as she forced the man to the ground. The stranger grunted in surprise as Sarah pinned him to the floor, the hunting knife slipping from his hand as he struggled to break free. Ethan scrambled out of the closet, his mind racing with the decision to either help or stay out of the way. The situation was spiraling out of control, and they were in no position to play games with a man who was willing to fight. "What the hell do you want?" Sarah demanded, her knee pressing into the man's chest as she struggled to hold him down. The man's face twisted with anger, but his eyes flickered with something else, fear. He was trying to mask it, but Ethan could see it in his eyes. The survival instincts of this world had made everyone paranoid, but there was something about this stranger's fear that made Ethan uneasy. "I'm not your enemy," the stranger spat, his voice strained. "I'm just trying to survive." Sarah's grip loosened slightly, but she didn't let him up. "Then why were you following us?" I didn't know who you were," the man rasped, his breath shallow as he continued to struggle beneath her. "I thought you were one of them. The ones who take people, for food, for worse." Ethan's mind raced. He had heard stories of brutal survivors who preyed on others, using the chaos of the outbreak to get what they wanted. It was survival of the fittest, and no one was safe. The thought that someone might be willing to resort to such extremes made him sick to his stomach. "We're not like that," Ethan said firmly, taking a step closer. "We're just trying to survive." Sarah studied the man carefully for a moment, her face tight with skepticism. Finally, she let off her hold slightly, though she kept her hand on his chest, ready to strike if needed. "What's your name?" The man hesitated for a long moment before answering. "Dylan." "Dylan," Sarah repeated, her eyes narrowing. "How do we know we can trust you?" He looked at her, his eyes tired but sincere. "You don't. But I'm not here to hurt you. I've been on my own for weeks. And frankly, I'm tired of it." There was silence in the room, broken only by the distant sound of zombies moaning in the streets outside. Sarah slowly stood, giving the man just enough room to sit up. "You can stay for now. But don't think you'll be getting any favors." Dylan nodded gratefully, rubbing his neck where Sarah's knee had been. "I'm not asking for favors. I just need to survive." Ethan and Sarah exchanged a glance. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford, but they had no choice but to keep moving forward. Dylan, whether he liked it or not, was now part of the uneasy alliance. But the question lingered in the air, unspoken: how much danger would they face with this stranger at their side? Dylan's presence in the cabin was unsettling, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Ethan and Sarah exchanged wary glances as they watched him set his belongings down in the corner. Despite his story, there was something about him that didn't sit right. He had the look of a man who had been shaped by the apocalypse, someone who had learned to survive by any means necessary. But there was also a hunger in his eyes, not just for food, but for something else, something deeper. As Sarah settled into a corner with her weapon, watching Dylan with the careful eye of someone who had learned not to trust easily, Ethan began to think about their next move. They couldn't stay in the cabin forever. They needed to find a way to continue moving forward, to stay one step ahead of the zombies and the unpredictability of the world they now lived in. Dylan caught Ethan's gaze, sensing his unease. "You're wondering what I'm after, right?" he asked, his voice low and guarded. Ethan remained silent, but his eyes answered the question. They both knew that surviving in this world meant knowing who to trust and who to avoid. And right now, trust was a rare commodity. "I'm not here for trouble," Dylan said, reading the tension in the air. "I've seen enough of that. All I'm asking for is a chance to keep going, a chance to make it through this. We all have the same goal: survival." Sarah, who had been listening intently, shifted her weight and spoke up. "We've made it this far on our own. Why should we trust you to be any different from all the others we've met?" Dylan lowered his gaze, as if the question weighed on him. For a moment, there was a silence that felt almost too heavy to bear. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, he replied, "Because I've seen what happens when you don't trust anyone. I've seen how it ends. People get desperate. They turn on each other. And that's how we all die." Ethan nodded, his face thoughtful. He had seen it, too, the brutal betrayals, the way people changed in the face of danger. He had seen the madness take root in others. The world had twisted everyone. "We're not going to die," Sarah replied firmly. "Not today." Dylan's eyes flickered toward the window, his gaze lingering on the darkened landscape outside. "You may think you're safe here, but you're not. There's something worse than zombies lurking out there. A lot worse." Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. "What are you talking about?" Dylan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "It's not just the zombies you have to worry about. There are people out there, people who have learned how to control the infected. They use them, train them like animals. I've seen it happen. I've had close calls with them. They'll come for you when they realize you're a threat." The air in the cabin seemed to freeze. The thought of others like them, survivors who had somehow figured out how to manipulate the undead, sent a chill through Ethan's spine. The infected were already dangerous enough. The idea of them being used as weapons by other people was an entirely new level of horror. "How do you know this?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp, but with a trace of doubt. Dylan's face darkened. "I've seen it firsthand. I've watched them take control of a small group of zombies, using sound, fire, or even bait. They've created a whole new breed of terror out there. And if we're not careful, we're next." Ethan's mind raced. He wanted to believe that Dylan was just another paranoid survivor, but the urgency in his voice made him hesitate. What if he was telling the truth? What if they had been naive in thinking that the zombies were the only threat left? "We've got to go," Dylan continued, standing up abruptly. "They'll be coming for us soon, and when they do, we won't have time to prepare." Ethan and Sarah exchanged a look. It was clear that they weren't getting much rest in this cabin. The idea of venturing out again was terrifying, but staying in one place was beginning to feel just as dangerous. They had to make a decision. "Do you know where they are?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but tense. Dylan nodded, his expression grim. I've been tracking their movements. I know where they're heading next. We can get ahead of them, but we have to move now. Sarah stood up, brushing the dirt from her pants. She seemed to consider the options, her eyes flicking back and forth between Dylan and Ethan. Fine, she said finally. We'll go. But if we run into trouble because of you, I'm not afraid to leave you behind. Dylan's face tightened, but he didn't respond. He just grabbed his pack and slung it over his shoulder, ready to move. They stepped outside, the cold wind biting at their skin as they made their way through the overgrown trees that surrounded the cabin. The sky was dark, clouds swirling ominously above them as they made their way deeper into the woods. Every crunch of their boots on the dry leaves seemed amplified in the stillness, each one a reminder of how vulnerable they were. The deeper they went, the more the weight of the situation pressed down on them. The trees closed in around them, their branches creaking like the groans of the undead in the distance. Ethan could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, the sense of something unseen watching them growing stronger with each passing step. This way, Dylan muttered, gesturing for them to follow as he led the group down a narrow, hidden trail. The other survivors, those who control the infected, they're just ahead. We need to keep moving until we're out of their territory. Ethan didn't speak, but his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. If what Dylan said was true, they were in deeper trouble than they had imagined. The infected were no longer just mindless creatures, they were becoming weapons, tools for people to use. And no matter how hard they tried to survive, the world was only getting more twisted. The group moved through the woods in silence, each step feeling like a countdown to an unknown fate. Every rustling branch, every snap of a twig, made Ethan's heart race. The feeling of being hunted, of being watched, never left him. He couldn't shake the thought that there was something just beyond the trees, waiting for them to make a mistake. And as they neared their destination, he couldn't help but wonder, were they walking straight into a trap? The woods grew denser as they ventured further into the trees, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. The path ahead became harder to follow, the trees pressing closer together, casting shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the ground. The feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking their every movement, grew stronger with every step. Dylan led the way, his steps purposeful, but Ethan could see the strain on his face. The man was tense, glancing around every few seconds, as if expecting an ambush at any moment. Sarah, ever watchful, stayed close to Ethan, her grip on her weapon never loosening. Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of their situation. They had been walking for hours now, and the further they went, the less familiar everything seemed. The woods felt different, unnervingly quiet. No birds, no rustling animals, just the steady crunch of their boots on the forest floor and the distant moans of zombies, barely audible but ever present. It was as though they were being led into the heart of something much worse than they had imagined. Are we close? Sarah's voice broke the silence, low but sharp. Dylan glanced over his shoulder, his eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and determination. Almost there. Just a little further. The trees opened up ahead, revealing a small clearing. Ethan stopped dead in his tracks, his heart pounding. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a structure, no, more like a compound. A series of wooden barriers and makeshift walls had been built up around an area that looked like it had been turned into a fort. The walls were high, constructed with scavenged materials, and there were guard posts at the corners. It looked like something out of a bad dream. Is that where we're headed? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The sight of the compound sent a shiver down his spine. Something about it didn't sit right. It was too organized, too controlled. Dylan nodded, but there was an edge to his voice now, one that hinted at regret. Yeah. That's where they are. The people who've learned to control the zombies. They've been holed up there for weeks. But you need to understand, what you see outside that wall is just the surface. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? They've created something worse than you can imagine, Dylan said, his voice dropping to a whisper. They're using the zombies, manipulating them, training them to do their bidding. And they're not alone. There are others out there who want what they have. It's a war, one that we're caught in the middle of. Sarah stepped forward, her face hard. Are you telling us we have to go in there? Into that hellhole? Dylan hesitated, his gaze darting between the compound and the dense woods around them. I don't know if we have a choice. If we don't get in there and figure out what's going on, we're just going to be out here, picked off one by one. But we need to be careful. These people don't take kindly to outsiders. And once they know we're here, it's only a matter of time before they come after us. Ethan's stomach twisted with the realization. They were being drawn into something they had no control over. The compound might offer shelter, but it also held dangers they couldn't even begin to comprehend. We need to get closer, Sarah said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying her unease. We can't turn back now. But we need a plan. Dylan nodded, his expression dark. I know a way in. There's a gap in the walls on the far side. If we can get past the guards without being seen, we can get inside and figure out what they're really up to. Ethan glanced at Sarah, who was scanning the area with a calculating gaze. They were both on edge, but they knew the truth, there was no turning back now. Their best chance for survival lay in the heart of the very place that had caused them so much fear. As they moved closer, staying in the shadows of the trees, Ethan could hear voices, low murmurs and occasional shouts, coming from within the compound. There were people in there, survivors, but what kind of people were they? And what kind of horrors had they brought with them? The gap in the wall was narrow, barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through at a time. Dylan led the way, moving cautiously, his body pressed flat against the earth as he crawled through the opening. Sarah followed closely, her eyes darting around, always on the lookout for danger. Ethan brought up the rear, his heart racing as he crawled through the gap, acutely aware of every sound, every movement around them. Once inside, they found themselves in a small, overgrown courtyard, surrounded by walls that were thick with vines and moss. The area was eerily quiet, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He scanned the compound, his eyes darting from one building to the next. It wasn't much, just a few small, makeshift structures, but it was enough to house dozens of people, maybe more. Stay low, Dylan whispered, his voice barely audible. We can't let anyone see us. Not yet. They moved swiftly but silently, their footsteps muffled by the thick grass underfoot. The whole compound was a maze of paths and hidden corners, and every now and then, Ethan caught glimpses of people moving between the buildings. They were mostly armed, dressed in ragged clothing, their faces worn and grim. It wasn't until they reached the center of the compound that Ethan felt the shift in the air, a presence that made his skin crawl. The ground underfoot seemed to hum with a low, constant vibration, and the hairs on his neck stood on end. He turned to Sarah, his face pale. Do you feel that? Before she could answer, the ground beneath them trembled, and the air seemed to grow thick with an unnatural heat. And then, from the shadows of the compound, came the unmistakable sound of growling, low, guttural, and unmistakably inhuman. Dylan's eyes widened in alarm. They've trained them, they've brought them in here. From the dark corners of the compound, several figures appeared. They were zombies, at least, they looked like zombies, but they were moving with a purpose. Their eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, and they moved with the same precision as the humans who surrounded them. We've got to go, Dylan hissed, grabbing Ethan's arm and pulling him back into the shadows. Now! The realization hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. They hadn't just walked into a compound, they had walked into a nightmare. The war between survivors was already underway, and they had just become pawns in a game far bigger than they could have imagined. The real battle had only just begun. Part 8, The Final Escape. The world seemed to close in on them. The growls of the zombies, trained and weaponized, echoed through the compound like a death knell. Dylan's grip tightened on Ethan's arm as he yanked him back into the shadows, his voice harsh but urgent. We need to move. Now. We can't afford to stay here another second. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to process what was happening. These weren't ordinary zombies, these were predators, trained to obey their masters. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he caught sight of the creatures moving with unnatural coordination, their eyes glowing with an eerie, intelligence-driven light. They were weapons, used by people who had mastered a cruel, terrifying form of survival. And that knowledge made the compound feel less like a sanctuary and more like a death trap. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice low, as if speaking too loudly might attract the attention of the trained undead. Dylan scanned the compound with a look of desperation. "We can't stay here," he repeated, his eyes darting to the walls. "I know a way out. There's a tunnel underneath one of the buildings. But we have to get there without being seen." Sarah nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. "Let's move." They moved quickly and silently, hugging the walls, staying low to the ground. The compound, though chaotic, was strangely quiet except for the occasional shuffle and growl of the undead as they patrolled the area. Ethan's pulse raced with every step they took, the feeling of being watched never leaving him. He couldn't shake the thought that if they made one wrong move, they'd be caught in a trap far worse than they could imagine. As they neared the building Dylan had indicated, a loud, chilling howl pierced the air. One of the zombies, seemingly drawn by a noise or a shift in the wind, turned and locked eyes with them. Its mouth opened in a grotesque snarl, the glowing eyes narrowed with malice. The group froze, breath caught in their throats. For a split second, time seemed to stretch and snap. The zombie took a step toward them, its movements slow but deliberate. Dylan's voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. "Go! Now!" They bolted. The silence was shattered by the pounding of their feet against the ground, the rustling of leaves, and the frantic growls that followed them. Behind them, the zombie began to give chase, its grotesque form lumbering with terrifying speed, driven by the call of something more than hunger. The sound of its footfalls grew louder as it closed in on them, the air thick with the fear of being caught. They reached the building where the tunnel was hidden, Dylan's hand already at the door, shoving it open with urgency. "Inside, quick," he shouted. Ethan and Sarah rushed in, ducking into the dark interior just as the zombies' growls reached a fever pitch. The door slammed shut behind them, but it wasn't enough to muffle the sounds of the chaos outside. They were in, but they weren't safe, not yet. The tunnel was narrow and claustrophobic, its walls lined with damp earth and jagged rocks. It smelled like decay and earth, but it was their only chance at survival. Dylan led the way, his movements swift and sure. There was no time to question where this tunnel led, or what awaited them at the end. All they could do was keep moving. "How much farther?" Sarah's voice broke the silence, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Not far," Dylan replied, his voice grim. "We'll be out on the other side soon. But the hardest part is still ahead." Ethan swallowed hard, trying to steady his racing thoughts. The air felt thick and oppressive, as though the earth itself was closing in on them. They'd been running for so long, how much longer could they keep this up? And what would they find when they finally emerged from the tunnel? They reached the end of the tunnel, and Dylan stopped. "Get ready," he whispered, his eyes flashing with a mix of fear and resolve. "This is where it gets tricky." They emerged into a small, open area, a patch of wilderness surrounded by trees. But it wasn't the peaceful scene they had hoped for. Ahead, in the distance, there was movement. More of the trained zombies, patrolling the area in tight formation, their eyes glowing eerily under the moonlight. "We can't just walk through that," Sarah muttered, her voice tight with frustration. "No, we can't," Dylan agreed. "But we have to try. We don't have a choice. We'll need to move under their radar, stay low, and use the trees for cover. If we're seen, we're dead." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. The zombies were unpredictable, but they weren't the only threat out there. The survivors who had mastered control over the undead were still lurking in the shadows. The fight for survival was never over, no matter how far they ran, no matter how many times they thought they'd escaped. The world they lived in was a constant nightmare, and there was no way to wake up from it. They crouched low, moving like shadows through the trees. The zombies ahead moved in eerie sync, their movements coordinated like a patrol, their eyes scanning the area with a methodical, calculating gaze. It was a game of cat and mouse now. Every step they took, every movement they made could tip the balance between life and death. They managed to slip past the patrol, their breathing shallow, their hearts thudding in their chests. But as they moved deeper into the trees, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The world had shifted. Survival was no longer just about outrunning zombies, it was about outsmarting the people who controlled them. Suddenly, a loud crack sounded from behind them. Dylan's eyes widened in alarm. "Run," he shouted. They didn't need to be told twice. The ground beneath them trembled as the horde of zombies, unleashed and enraged, began to pursue them. Ethan's legs burned, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The trees blurred around him as he pushed forward, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Behind him, Sarah was close, her weapon raised, ready for whatever was chasing them. They reached a ridge, an open field on the other side. The zombies were closing in fast, their growls deafening, but in the distance, there was a truck, abandoned but still operational. Dylan bolted toward it, the others following in a mad dash. The truck's engine roared to life as they slammed into the cab, barely escaping the jaws of the undead. They had survived. For now. As the truck sped away, leaving the nightmare behind, Ethan looked at Sarah and Dylan, both of them covered in dirt and blood. They had made it, but the reality of their situation settled in. They weren't safe. Not yet. The world had changed, and the fight for survival was far from over. The apocalypse wasn't something they could outrun, it was a nightmare they would have to live through, one terrifying day at a time.